Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The house, our father's house, was a mausoleum of dust and forgotten air. A cavern of silence so profound I could hear the slow, settling sigh of the foundations giving up the ghost. A sound that seemed to mimic my own internal surrender as I stood in the foyer. My duffel bag feeling less like luggage and more like an anchor pulling me down into the worn, floral-patterned carpet that still held the ghostly impressions of 1,000 childhood footsteps. It smelled of pledge and decay, a cloying sweetness over a base note of damp plaster and something else, something metallic and cold that I could only identify as the scent of absence. The olfactory ghost of the man who had built this place, filled it with noise and life, and then quietly exited stage left, leaving the three of us, his fractured, fractious audience, to sort through the props and sets of his final act. The light that afternoon was the color of weak tea, filtering through windows grimy with a decade of neglect, catching the motes of dust that danced like static in the still air. A million tiny worlds swirling in the wake of our intrusion. And I felt the weight of it all, the sheer, oppressive memory of everything, pressed down on my shoulders, a physical force that made my already slumped posture curl in on itself, a silent admission of a defeat that was both financial and spiritual. I was broke, achingly so, the kind of broke that keeps you up at night staring at the ceiling as a cold knot of panic tightens in your gut. And this house, this equal share of this crumbling, money pit of a Victorian on the outskirts of a town that itself seemed to be dying, was to be my salvation, the liquidated asset that would finally pry the creditor's claws from my throat, a fact that filled me not with relief but with a thick, syrupy guilt that I carried with me from room to room, a shameful secret I kept from my siblings, from the ghost of my father, from myself. Chloe arrived next, her little hybrid car whispering to a stop on the gravel drive, and I watched her from the living room window, saw her sit for a long moment, her head bowed over the steering wheel, gathering herself, and when she finally emerged, her face was a pale, delicate mask of raw grief, her eyes red-rimmed even from this distance, and she moved with the tentative fragility of a ghost already, clutching her oversized cardigan around her as if it were a suit of armor against the chill of loss. She was the believer, the feeler, the one who'd gotten all the spirituality and none of the skepticism. The middle child who had always navigated by emotion as if it were the truest north. And seeing her like this, so utterly unmoored, made my own chest ache with a protective instinct I hadn't felt since we were kids. When I'd shoo away the monsters under her bed with the absolute authority of an eldest brother who knew, just knew, that nothing was lurking in the dark. "It still smells like him," were her first words to me, whispered into my chest as I hugged her on the porch, her voice thick with tears. And she was right, the faint, familiar scent of his pipe tobacco, that cherry blend he'd smoked for 40 years, still clung to the curtains, to the old armchair by the fireplace, a scent that was both comfort and a dagger to the heart. Mark was the last to arrive, of course, because Mark was always punctual, always precise, his sensible sedan parked neatly behind Chloe's car, his expression one of calm, measured sadness as he joined us in the kitchen, the heart of the house, now a cold and forlorn place with its humming refrigerator and calendar still turned to the month he died. "Well," he said, placing a bag of groceries on the counter with a quiet finality, "here we are." He was the pragmatic one, the youngest who had somehow become the adult, the steady hand who had handled the funeral arrangements, liaised with the lawyers, made the lists, and his calmness was a balm, a rock in the turbulent sea of Chloe's emotions and my own quiet, desperate anxiety. "The reading is tomorrow at 10, he continued, pulling out 3 beers, the familiar click of the caps a sound from 1,000 childhood summers. Simpson says it's straightforward. Everything divided equally 3 ways. The house, the investments, the lot." He handed me a bottle, our eyes meeting, and I saw in his gaze a reflection of my own relief, though his, I was sure, was for simpler, cleaner reasons, order, fairness, the smooth execution of a plan. For me, it was a lifeline. We spent that first evening in a haze of shared, stilted nostalgia, moving through the rooms like cautious archivists, pulling open drawers and cabinets, each discovered object, a faded school report card, a tarnished silver trophy for a long-forgotten bowling league, a bundle of love letters from our mother, who had left us all so much earlier in a different, more abrupt tragedy, sending ripples through the quiet pond of our grief. Chloe would gasp and hold something to her chest, tears welling anew, while Mark would examine it with a curator's detached interest before placing it in one of the piles he was already mentally assembling. Keep, sell, donate. I just drifted, feeling like an imposter in my own history, my hand trailing over the banister, its wood worn smooth by the passage of our collective youth, each creak of the floorboard underfoot a note in a familiar symphony of home, a symphony that now felt dirge-like and mournful. We ordered a pizza because none of us could face cooking in his kitchen, and we ate it on the floor of the living room, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes, the grease staining the cardboard plates, a pathetic, modern picnic in the midst of a century's worth of accumulated life. It was Chloe who brought it up, her voice small and tentative in the growing darkness as the sun bled out behind the tall firs at the edge of the property. Do you remember that summer we found the Ouija board?" she asked, and a cold little trickle of something, not fear, not yet, but a precursor to it, a primal awareness, ran down my spine. I did remember. It had been a rainy August afternoon, much like this one was threatening to become, and we'd been ferreting around in the basement, a damp, earth-floored kingdom of shadows and spiders, and we'd found it tucked behind an old coal scuttle, its box faded and water-stained, but the board itself pristine. The letters and numbers stark black on smooth, mysterious wood, the planchette a heart-shaped sliver of polished pine with a cloudy, dime-sized viewing glass at its apex. We'd used it, giggling and pushing at each other's fingers, asking it childish questions about who we would marry and what we would be when we grew up. And I, even at 12, had been the skeptic, the one who deliberately guided the pointer to spell out silly, nonsensical answers, much to Chloe's wide-eyed delight and Mark's quiet, observant frustration. "I wonder if it's still down there," Chloe murmured, her gaze drifting towards the basement door, a dark, vertical mouth in the kitchen wall. Maybe we could try it, just to see, to feel close to him." I snorted, a harsh, ugly sound in the quiet room. "Chloe, come on. That's a toy for kids. It's nonsense." But Mark, surprisingly, was the one who gently countered me. "It might be cathartic," he said, his tone reasonable, soothing. "A bit of silly fun to break the tension. And who knows, maybe it'll give Chloe some peace." He gave a small, sad smile. "Dad would have gotten a kick out of it, I think." And that, the invocation of our father's potential amusement, was the masterstroke. It painted my skepticism as not just cynical but disrespectful, a dismissal of a potential moment of familial connection. I relented, of course, because the weight of the day was heavy upon me, and because the thought of fighting, of causing Chloe more pain, was exhausting. "Fine," I sighed, the word tasting of dust and resignation. "But if we summon a demon, you're explaining it to the priest." The descent into the basement was a journey back in time, each step on the narrow, steep stairs a creaking protest, the air growing colder and damper with every foot of altitude lost, the smell of wet earth and old stone rising to meet us, a primal scent that spoke of things buried and forgotten. Mark led the way, his flashlight beam cutting a swath through the absolute blackness, illuminating the spectral shapes of covered furniture, stacks of National Geographic magazines from the 70s bound with twine, a broken rocking horse that had been mine, its paint faded to a ghostly gray. It was Mark who found it, right where we'd left it all those years ago, behind the same coal scuttle, as if it had been waiting for us, patient and dormant. He blew the dust from the box, a cloud of history that glittered in the flashlight's beam, and carried it back upstairs like a relic, placing it on the kitchen table where we had eaten so many meals, where our father had paid bills and helped us with homework, a surface now sanctified and violated by this absurd cardboard artifact. The board itself was just as I remembered it, the wood surprisingly heavy, smooth and cool to the touch, the letters and numbers painted with a faintly Art Nouveau flourish. The words yes and no nestled in the corners like watchful sentinels, the sun and moon symbols at the top seeming to watch us with a cryptic, painted gaze. The planchette felt colder than the room, a surprising, seeping chill that seemed to leach the warmth from my fingertips as we placed them upon it. The three of us forming a reluctant triangle around the table. The overhead light a single, bare bulb that cast our faces into sharp relief, creating pools of shadow in our eye sockets that made us all look like skulls. Chloe had lit a candle for atmosphere, she said, and its flickering, unstable light danced over the board, making the letters seem to swim and shift. "We should ask if anyone is there," she whispered, her voice hushed with a reverence that made my skin crawl. I rolled my eyes but complied, my fingertips resting lightly on the plastic heart, feeling the faint, almost imperceptible tremor of my siblings' own minute movements. For a long moment, nothing happened. There was only the sound of our breathing, the distant groan of the house settling, the frantic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. I was about to make a sarcastic comment, to break the tension and end this foolishness, when I felt it, a subtle, insistent pressure beneath my fingers, a vibration that was not our own. The planchette twitched. It was a small, jerky movement, like a muscle spasm, and it slid a bare inch to the left, coming to rest squarely on the word yes. Chloe gasped a sharp, indrawn breath. "Did you do that?" I hissed at Mark, my skepticism a flimsy shield now. He shook his head, his face a mask of earnest concentration in the candlelight. "My fingers are barely touching it," he murmured, and it was true, his touch was feather-light. Ask who it is." Chloe's voice was trembling. "Who are you?" The response was slower this time, the movement less jerky, more deliberate, a smooth, almost gliding motion that felt utterly alien to the hesitant push and pull of our childhood games. It moved with a purpose that was deeply, fundamentally unsettling. It spelled out, with a slow, terrible certainty, Father. A coldness that had nothing to do with the basement's chill seized me. A visceral dread that started in the pit of my stomach and radiated outwards, icing my veins. This wasn't fun. This wasn't cathartic. This was wrong. "It's him," Chloe breathed, tears sparkling in her eyes. "It's Dad." The planchette began to move again, not waiting for a question, its motion faster now, more urgent, the little heart skittering across the board as if pulled by an invisible string. It circled the board once, twice, a dizzying, frantic orbit, before shooting up to the top, hovering over the moon symbol, then darting down to spell out a single, stark word, attic. It repeated it, again and again, attic, attic, the movement becoming almost violent, a frantic scraping against the wood that set my teeth on edge. Then it stopped dead center, before moving one last time, with a final, emphatic shove that felt like it came from a place of immense strength to spell will. And then it was still. The silence that followed was heavier than any I have ever known, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to smother the very air in the room. The three of us stared at the board, then at each other, our faces pale and shocked in the guttering candlelight. My rational mind scrambled for purchase, throwing up explanations like feeble barricades against a rising tide of primal fear. Subconscious movement, a draft, a collective hallucination born of grief and suggestion. But the feeling, the sheer physical sensation of that thing moving with a will that was not our own, was imprinted on my nerve endings. I could still feel the cold, purposeful energy thrumming through the plastic. "The attic," Chloe whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. "He wants us to go to the attic, to the will." The pull-down ladder to the attic was in the upstairs hallway, its cord hanging like a noose in the dim light. It groaned in protest as Mark tugged it down, releasing a shower of dust and the smell of centuries of trapped heat and forgotten things. The air that wafted down was hot, thick, and suffocating, smelling of old paper, mothballs, and the sweet, cloying scent of decayed wood. It was the breath of the house itself, exhaling a secret it had held for too long. "This is insane," I muttered, but the words lacked conviction. The memory of the planchette's violent, insistent movement was too fresh, too visceral. We had to go up. We had to know. Mark went first, his flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness above, followed by Chloe, her movements hesitant and fearful. I brought up the rear, the rungs of the ladder creaking ominously under my weight, each step feeling like an ascent into a different, more malevolent world. The attic was exactly as I remembered it from childhood dares. A vast, low-ceilinged cavern, a landscape of shadows and memory, the roof beams arching overhead like the blackened ribs of some great, beached leviathan. The space was a chaotic museum of our lives, a physical manifestation of our family's history. Towers of cardboard boxes, their sides bulging, were labeled in our mother's neat hand. Christmas decorations, baby clothes, tax records 1985 to 1990. An old crib stood sentinel in one corner, a dusty mobile of faded stars hanging above it. There was the rocking chair my mother had nursed us in, the wicker now brittle and broken. My old hockey gear lay in a moldering heap next to Mark's meticulously built model rocket collection. Chloe's dolls, their porcelain faces cracked and smudged with grime, stared blankly from a tea party set up on a mildewed blanket. It was overwhelming, a tangible, suffocating presence of the past, and for a moment, the sheer weight of it all made me forget why we were there. We stood in a silent, dusty triangle, the beams of our flashlights cutting intersecting paths through the gloom, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. "The will," Chloe said, her voice small and muffled by the oppressive atmosphere. "But where? It could be anywhere." Mark, ever the pragmatist, took charge. "We look for anything that looks official. File boxes. Dad's old desk." He pointed his light towards the far wall, where a massive, ancient roll-top desk, a piece I remembered from his study before he'd updated to a modern one, was half buried under a stack of paintings covered in yellowed sheets. "Start there." The next hour was a slow, arduous excavation, a physical battle against the accumulated detritus of a lifetime. We moved boxes, our muscles straining, sweat tracing clean paths through the dust on our faces. Cobwebs, thick and ancient, clung to our hair and clothes like gossamer shrouds. The air grew hotter, harder to breathe, each lungful tasting of time itself. We found financial records from the 80s, bundles of love letters from our parents' courtship, every school report card we'd ever brought home, my father's army discharge papers. But no will. The existing will, the one we knew about, was safe with Lawyer Simpson. This was a fool's errand, I began to think, a hysterical wild goose chase prompted by a piece of plastic and our own suggestible grief. I was about to call it quits, to suggest we go back downstairs and open a bottle of our father's good scotch instead, when Mark, who had been quietly and methodically going through the drawers of the old desk, let out a soft, sharp exhale. "I found something," he said, his voice oddly flat. He was holding a large, flat, leather-bound album I recognized instantly. Our parents' wedding album. It was something sacred, a relic we had rarely been allowed to touch as children. He laid it carefully on top of a box and opened it. The pages were brittle, the photographs themselves faded to shades of sepia and gray, capturing the smiling, hopeful faces of two people who had no idea what the future held. There, tucked between the page showing their first dance and the page of them cutting the cake, was not a photograph, but a long, business-sized envelope. It was crisp white and looked utterly, jarringly new amidst the yellowed pages of the album. It was addressed, in our father's familiar, looping handwriting, to Estate Attorney E. Simpson. And below that, typed on a label, were the words, "Last will and testament, supersedes all previous." The world seemed to slow down, the dust motes freezing in their dance. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Chloe reached for it, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely grasp it. She tore the envelope open, her breath coming in short, ragged pants, and pulled out a sheaf of thick, legal paper. The three of us huddled around the album, our three flashlight beams converging on the document, creating a pool of stark white light in the overwhelming darkness. The language was dense, legalese, but the meaning was horrifyingly, brutally clear. It was dated just 6 months ago. It revoked all prior wills and codicils, and it named a sole beneficiary. Not Alexander James Brennan, not Chloe Marie Brennan, Not Mark Robert Brennan. The entire estate, the house, the investments, the life insurance, every single asset, was left to one person, Elara Vance. A name I had never heard in my life. The terms were specific, ironclad. She was identified as his devoted living caretaker and sole comfort in his final years, to whom he bequeathed everything in gratitude for her unwavering companionship and care, which allowed him to remain in the home he loved. We were disinherited, completely, utterly. The words swam on the page, the formal, typed letters seeming to morph into cruel, mocking shapes. The silence in the attic was no longer just heavy. It was malignant, a physical entity pressing in on us, stealing the oxygen from the hot, thick air. I felt the floor lurch beneath my feet, a dizzying, vertiginous drop that had nothing to do with altitude. My salvation, my lifeline, was gone, vanished, replaced by the name of a stranger. The guilt I had felt earlier curdled instantly into a black, toxic rage. Who was she? Some predator who had slithered into his life when he was vulnerable. Some gold-digging nurse who had whispered poison in his ear, isolating him from his own children. Chloe made a sound, a small, wounded animal whimper that broke the silence. It grew in volume and pitch, escalating into a full-bodied, gut-wrenching sob that seemed to tear itself from the very core of her being. She collapsed against a stack of boxes, the wool fluttering from her nerveless fingers to the dusty floor, her body racked with the force of her despair. It was a sound of absolute betrayal, of a loss so profound it was metaphysical. She hadn't just lost her inheritance, she had lost her father, the man she believed loved her, the man she had thought was reaching out to her from beyond the grave. That belief had been shattered, replaced by this cold, legalistic cruelty. Why? She wailed, the word echoing in the cramped space. Why would he do this? Who is she? He never mentioned anyone. Never. I was frozen, staring at the document on the floor, the crisp white paper of blasphemy against the faded, loving photographs in the open album. My mind was a roaring static, a white noise of financial ruin and bewildered hurt. I looked at Mark, expecting to see my own shock and devastation mirrored on his face. And for a moment I did. His mouth was agape, his eyes wide. He looked as blindsided as I felt. He moved to comfort Chloe, his hand on her shoulder, his voice a low, soothing murmur. It's okay, Chloe, it's okay. We'll figure this out. There has to be an explanation. Maybe he wasn't in his right mind. We can contest this. It was the perfect thing to say, the reasonable, pragmatic response. It was what I should have been saying. But I wasn't. I was still trapped in that moment of initial impact, my eyes darting around the attic, unable to focus, seeking anything to anchor me in this new, horrifying reality. My gaze swept over a large, dust-covered pane of glass that had once been part of an old storm window, leaning against a beam. It was filthy, but it functioned as a dim, ghostly mirror, reflecting our scene back at us in smeared, monochrome shades of gray. I saw Chloe's hunched, sobbing form. I saw my own pale, stunned face, a mask of confusion. And I saw Mark kneeling beside her, his back mostly to me, his face partially visible in the murky reflection. His body language was all concern, his shoulders slumped in a perfect pantomime of shared grief. But his face in the distorted, dusty glass, for a fraction of a second, a sliver of time so brief I would later question if I had truly seen it at all, his expression was not one of shock or sorrow. The corners of his mouth were not turned down in grief. They were lifted, ever so slightly. It wasn't a full smile. It was a smirk, a tiny, fleeting, triumphant flash of satisfaction that was there and then gone, wiped away so completely and replaced with such a convincing mask of brotherly concern that my brain, reeling from the dual blows of the will and this new, nascent horror, refused to process it at first. It was just an anomaly, a trick of the flickering light and the dirty glass, a misfiring neuron in my own traumatized mind. I blinked, and it was gone. He was just Mark again, my calm, reliable younger brother, trying to hold our shattered family together. But the seed was planted, a tiny, black, poisonous seed of doubt that took root in the fertile soil of my betrayal and began, instantly, to grow. The days that followed were a blur of grim, funereal activity, a numb procession of phone calls to lawyers. First Simpson, whose bafflement seemed genuine, then the sharp, expensive voices of litigators Mark quickly found, and hollow conversations that circled the same draining questions without ever finding answers. The name Alara Vance was a ghost haunting the house. We found no trace of her, no forgotten toothbrush in the bathroom, no unfamiliar robe on the back of a door, no photograph tucked in a drawer. It was as if she had never existed, a phantom beneficiary conjured by a dying man's confused mind or, as my new, gnawing suspicion suggested, by something far more calculated. Mark was a rock, the perfect picture of supportive, organized outrage. He made the coffee, took copious notes during calls with the attorneys, spoke in calm, measured tones about undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. He was the reasonable one, the one thinking clearly, the one we should all listen to. He was also, I began to notice with a slow dawning chill, the one gently, subtly steering the narrative. He'd say things like, "It's a good thing we found this together," or "Can you imagine if just one of us had found it? The others might not have believed it." He positioned himself as the central hub of the coming legal battle, the point of contact, the one who would handle the stress of dealing with the lawyers so Chloe and I wouldn't have to. He was being helpful. He was being the good brother. But the memory of that smirk in the dusty glass would not leave me. It played on a loop in the quiet moments, especially at night when the house was its most vocal, its groans and settles sounding like whispers just on the edge of hearing. I began to watch him, this brother I thought I knew. I watched the way his grief never seemed to overwhelm him, how his sadness was always perfectly proportionate and timed, a tool to be deployed for effect. I watched how he'd gently stoke Chloe's anger towards the mysterious Alara, encouraging her tears and then soothing them, making himself indispensable to her emotional state, fracturing our natural alliance as the two older siblings, drawing her over to his side. My paranoia, once a tiny seed, unfurled into a dark, tangled vine that crept through my mind, constricting my thoughts. I started my own quiet investigation, a pathetic counterpoint to the real legal one being mounted. I began in the attic, returning to the scene of the crime alone, armed with a better flashlight and a sick feeling in my gut. I ignored the wedding album and the will. I looked for something else, anything else that felt out of place. I sifted through the boxes near the desk, through piles of old bank statements and insurance documents. And I found it. Tucked inside a manila folder labeled Old Receipts was a carbon copy of a receipt from a local office supply store. It was dated 8 months ago. The item purchased was listed as legal document envelope, package/10. Paid for in cash. It meant nothing on its own. Our father could have bought them for anything. But he hadn't. The will we found was in that exact type of envelope, crisp and new. And our father, a creature of habit, had always bought his office supplies from the same family-owned stationery shop in town that had closed down 5 years ago. He wouldn't have gone to a big box store. Mark would have. The next piece came from a memory, dislodged by the receipt's discovery. A conversation from about 7 months ago. A rare phone call with my father. He'd sounded tired, older than his years. I'd been distracted, preoccupied with my own crumbling life, but I'd asked how he was. He'd said, "Oh, getting by. Mark's been a godsend, helping me get my affairs in order. Making things right." I'd taken it as a throwaway comment. Making things right. The phrase now echoed in my head with a sinister new meaning. Mark had been the last one to visit him alone, just a week before he died. He'd told us he'd spent the weekend watching old movies with him. That dad had been peaceful, happy. What if he'd been something else? Confused? Pressured? The final, chilling piece fell into place when I was going through my father's old address book, looking for any number for this Alara Vance. I didn't find her, but I did find a number, scribbled in the back in Mark's neat, architectural handwriting. Next to it was a name, E. Vance, and a notation, Caregiver Services. It wasn't proof, not in a court of law, but it was proof in the courtroom of my own crumbling reality. Mark hadn't just known about her. He had found her. He had hired her. The entire narrative, the beautiful, cruel symmetry of it, unfolded in my mind with a clarity that was more terrifying than any ghost. He'd known about the new will. He'd known it would disinherit us. He'd known we would contest it, that it would lead to a long, ugly, expensive legal battle that would drain the estate and shatter the family. But he couldn't be the one to find it. He couldn't just produce it. The suspicion would have fallen on him instantly. He needed a discovery method so spectacular, so beyond reproach, that it would absolve him of all blame. He needed a miracle, so he orchestrated one. He used Chloe's grief and spirituality, her desperate need for a sign, as the fuel. He used my skepticism as a foil, making the eventual supernatural revelation seem more authentic by having me there to doubt it. He used the Ouija board, a relic from our childhood, as the perfect, blasphemous puppet. He guided the planchette, his touch so light and skilled we never felt it, spelling out the words that would lead us on our macabre treasure hunt. He knew exactly where he had hidden the will, in the one place we would never think to look for a legal document, a place that would lend the discovery an air of profound, personal significance. He made us find it together. He made us believe our dead father had led us to it. He made us the authors of our own disinheritance. The horror of it was absolute, all-consuming. It wasn't about the money anymore, not for me. It was about the violation, the profound, psychological violation of it all. He hadn't just stolen our inheritance, he had stolen our grief. He had taken our raw, honest sorrow and used it as a stage prop in his meticulously planned play. He had poisoned our last memories of our father, turning a deathbed change of heart into a calculated act of malice, and he had used a child's toy to do it. The Ouija board hadn't remembered the will. Mark had, and he had made us all act it out, turning our family's love for each other and for our father into a weapon to be wielded for his own profit. The legal battle is underway now, a soulless, grinding process of depositions and motions. We are suing the estate, which is to say, we are suing the Phantom Alara Vance, a case built on the claim of our father's diminished capacity. Mark is the perfect plaintiff, earnest and wronged. Chloe vacillates between rage at our father and a desperate hope that his spirit will somehow intervene and make things right. She leans on Mark for everything. They are a team. I am the outlier, the quiet one, the brother who has become withdrawn and sullen, who doesn't contribute meaningfully to the strategy sessions. They think I'm just depressed, beaten down by the loss. They have no idea that I am living in a constant state of low-grade terror, that every time I look at my brother, I see a master manipulator, a stranger whose capacity for cold, calculated evil dwarfs any fictional horror I could ever imagine. The house is sold now, the proceeds frozen in a court account. I'm back in my apartment, the creditors closer than ever. But that's not what keeps me up at night. I sit in the dark and I see it. The board. I took it. It sits on my coffee table now, a silent, wooden accomplice. I look at the smooth surface, the painted letters, the heart-shaped planchette. I remember the chill of it under my fingers, the unnatural force with which it moved. The horror is not that it might have been real. The horror is that it wasn't. The horror is that the evil we were contacting wasn't in the spirit world. It was sitting right next to me, his fingers resting lightly on the plastic, a tiny, triumphant smirk hiding just beneath a mask of brotherly concern. The Ouija board didn't remember the will. It was just a piece of wood. But he remembered. He remembered, and he made us all forget who we were to each other. And in doing so, he didn't just break our family. He set fire to the entire history of it, leaving me alone in the ashes, staring at a child's toy and understanding, finally, that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who learn to wear the skin of those you love. The silence in my apartment is a different creature than the one in my father's house. That was a silence of absence, of history and memory settling into dust. But this is a silence of paralysis, a vacuum where the future used to be. And it is in this hollowed-out quiet that the details of Mark's betrayal bloom in my mind with a vicious, obsessive clarity, each new recollection a fresh cut. And I find myself compulsively replaying every moment of that weekend, searching for the cracks I missed. The tells in his performance that were there all along if only I'd had the eyes to see them. The way he'd been the one to suggest ordering pizza, ensuring we'd all be in the same room, relaxed, vulnerable, when Chloe floated her idea. The way he'd been the one to first head down into the basement, giving him a precious few seconds alone to perhaps ensure the board was exactly where he remembered it, to wipe the worst of the dust from the box to make it seem newly discovered, the way his flashlight beam had lingered just a moment too long on that coal scuttle, a beacon guiding us to the prop he needed, the way his fingers had been the first to settle on the planchette, claiming the position of control, his touch so deceptively light, the conductor's gentle guidance of his orchestra of grief. I remember the slight pressure of his knee against mine under the table, a subtle anchor point, a way to gauge and counteract any unconscious movement from me, the skeptic, and I remember the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his forearm, not from fear, but from the intense, focused effort of micromanaging the planchette's movement, making it seem jerky and possessed at first, a spirit struggling to break through, before allowing it to smooth out into that terrible, gliding certainty, performance designed to bypass my rationality and speak directly to Chloe's desperate heart. He spelled it all out for us, letter by cruel letter, not with the help of some discarnate entity, but with the cold, calculating focus of a chess master moving his pieces into checkmate. And the most brilliant, the most devastating part of his scheme was that he made us complicit in our own undoing. Our own fingers were on the planchette. We felt its movement. We believed we were participants in a miracle. And that belief, that visceral shared experience, made the subsequent discovery in the attic unassailable, a truth delivered not by him, but by a force beyond ourselves. He didn't lead us to the attic ladder. He hung back, letting Chloe's newfound certainty drive her forward, letting me follow in confused pursuit, making himself merely a follower in the procession he had orchestrated. And in the attic, his excavation of the desk was a masterpiece of misdirection, a careful, patient performance of searching through the obvious places first, building the tension, making the eventual discovery feel earned and real. And his choice of the wedding album was a stroke of malicious genius, a deliberate defilement of our most sacred familial artifact, knowing that finding a document of such cold, legal disinheritance nestled within the pages that celebrated the beginning of our family would magnify the shock and the sense of betrayal 1,000-fold, ensuring our emotional responses would be so raw and overwhelming that none of us would be capable of critical thought in that moment. He knew Chloe would shatter. He knew I would freeze. And he knew that in that vacuum of coherent reaction, he could step in as the calm, capable center, the responsible one, the good son, and begin immediately weaving the narrative of contesting the will, positioning himself as our champion, all while secretly knowing that every dollar spent on legal fees was a dollar wasted, a dollar that would ultimately deplete the estate he was supposedly fighting for us to share, but that he, in some way I haven't yet fully unraveled, must have believed, would eventually benefit him alone. The name Alara Vance is the key, I'm sure of it, a lock for which only he holds the key. Perhaps she is a fiction, a name on a document, and he has some plan to claim the estate as her representative once we are broken and bankrupted by the legal fight. Or perhaps she is real, a paid accomplice who will disappear with a small cut after the dust settles, leaving him to inherit as the sole remaining heir once Chloe and I are driven away, impoverished and estranged. I lie awake at night. The city sounds a distant hum against my window, and I trace the contours of his plan until my head aches, each new layer of deception revealing a deeper, colder stratum of his calculation. And the question that haunts me, that truly terrifies me, is not how he did it, but why he chose this particular grotesque method, why the Ouija board. Was it simply the most effective tool available, a piece of ready-made theater from our childhood? Or was there a deeper, more sadistic satisfaction for him in the act itself, in perverting a symbol of our innocent childhood games into an instrument of his adult avarice, in using our shared history as the weapon to destroy our shared future? I look at the board on my coffee table, and it seems to stare back, not with malicious intent, but with a blank, wooden indifference, and I understand now that its power was never supernatural. Its power was always its perfect plausibility as a conduit for the unknown. A reputation built on parlor tricks and subconscious desires that Mark exploited with the precision of a surgeon. And in doing so, he didn't just rob us of our money, he robbed us of our truth. He rewired our reality, forcing us to accept a version of events that was so profoundly, personally unbelievable that to question it felt like madness. And in that, he committed a violence far greater than theft. He violated the very fabric of our shared memory. He took the story of our father's death and our family's end, and he edited it, inserting himself as the hero and a phantom as the villain. And in the process, he murdered whatever was left of the brothers I thought we were. The phone rings sometimes. It's usually Chloe, her voice thin and frayed, updating me on the latest legal non-development. Her words always circling back to what Mark said, what Mark thinks we should do. Her faith in him now absolute, a lifeline she clutches in the storm he created. And I have to bite my tongue until I taste blood to keep from screaming the truth at her, because I know with a cold certainty that she wouldn't believe me, that my evidence is a collection of circumstantial ghosts. A smudge on a window, a forgotten receipt, a scribbled phone number. That would sound like the ravings of a bitter, disinherited brother driven mad by jealousy, and that by accusing him, I would only succeed in finally fracturing our relationship beyond any hope of repair, completing the work he began. And so I play my part, I grunt in agreement, I promise to review the documents the lawyer sent. I perform the role of the defeated older brother, all the while listening to the faint, smug silence I know is on his end of the line, him listening in on her speakerphone, monitoring my compliance, ensuring his production is still running according to script. I am a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of a tragedy I can see unfolding, but am powerless to stop, because the only weapon I have is the truth. And the truth in this case is so outlandish, so perfectly crafted to be unbelievable, that it is utterly useless, and the weight of this knowledge is a constant, physical pressure on my chest, a despair so complete it feels like drowning in slow motion. I take the planchette in my hand sometimes, its surface cool and smooth, and I place it on the board, my fingers resting where ours did, and I try to feel it, to understand the mechanics of his deception, the subtle muscle movements, the controlled pressures, but it remains inert, dead wood. And the only movement is the frantic, desperate pounding of my own heart, a trapped animal beating against the bars of a cage it didn't even know existed. The horror is not in the board, it never was. The horror is in the perfect, smiling normalcy of my brother's face during our weekly conference calls, the concern in his voice as he asks if I'm eating enough, the reasonable tone he uses to discuss the draining of our father's estate to pay the lawyers who are fighting a phantom of his creation. The horror is in the banality of his evil, the way it wears the face of family and speaks in the language of care. He hasn't just taken my inheritance, he has taken my past, he has weaponized my memories, and he is systematically destroying my future, all while asking me with brotherly concern how I'm holding up. And the most terrifying part, the thought that wakes me in a cold sweat night after night, is the dawning realization that he is not done, that this is only the second act, and that I, the skeptical brother, the one who saw the flicker of the truth in a dusty window, am now the loose end, the variable in his perfect equation, and I have no idea what he has planned for the finale.